Hi class, I want to talk about the guidelines for the research paper. So in our momentum course, you want to go to content and then information for paper 2. And then the first document you see should be the guidelines. You want to download that, and that's what I'm looking at right now. So this paper, minimum 1,500 words, maximum 1,700, although if a paper is really well written, it can exceed that a bit, and it should be okay. So I explain a little bit about what a research paper actually is, and I explain that for my class, I require that you have a minimum of 4 sources, and you have to have at least these kinds of sources. People always ask me, well, is it okay if I use a video? And I say yes, but you have to make sure that you have, first you have one book, print or ebook, a journal or magazine article, and it should be from either their own state, one of their own state databases in the library, or a reputable online magazine or a print magazine. One newspaper article from a newspaper or citation offering one of their own state databases. It could be an online newspaper, and one website. And I do advise you to try to find sources that are maybe government sources or a credible organization or an educational source. I'm not opposed to .coms, but it depends on the .com. Depends on how credible that source is. So once you have all of those kinds of sources, those 4 different kinds, then I'm fine if you have a video or whatever kind of source you want on top of that. I did advise you when we had our meeting and when we've talked with each other that you want to avoid choosing a topic that has an obvious or non-debatable aspects. So this paper has to be an argumentative essay. So in some way, what you end up proposing in your paper as your thesis has to be able to be argued. And what I mean by that is somebody could look at the evidence that you looked at or look at other evidence and say, oh, I don't really agree with you. And they could put forth their own theory and their own evidence to support their perspective. So that's what you're doing. You're giving what you believe the truth is based on the evidence, okay? And somebody else could argue with you about that. All right, so here's some information about the thesis. And I took this advice from the Harvard University's Writing Center, so it's a good idea to kind of check out these bits of advice here. This first bit here, a good standard place for your thesis statement is at the end of the introductory paragraph. I do want your thesis to be the final sentence of the introduction. I also think it's a good idea that your thesis sort of reflect or anticipate the counterarguments. And I will give you a handout that explains how to, step by step, write a good thesis statement. The thesis cannot be a question. Okay? The question is what guides you in your research, but your thesis is like the answer to the question. And it's possible that as we are drafting this research paper, your thesis will change over time, and that's to be expected. Okay? But just remember that your thesis cannot be a question. The thesis cannot be a list, okay? You should avoid being just vague and really, confrontational in your thesis. The thesis needs a definable, arguable claim. And I think it's a good idea for you to look at the examples that they've put here for, using the example of communism, the thesis about communism. What makes a good thesis and what actually is going to make it really an effective thesis. A thesis should be as clear and specific as possible. And then I've provided some other information about how to handle sources, just I guess, advice that reflects what students have asked me over the years. So I got this information from Simpson College. They had a really a nice sheet, a summarized sheet of advice, and I really liked what they said. So I pulled some advice from them and posted that here. So you want to look at the research paper as though it's almost like you're having a conversation with someone who's not in front of you, and you're trying to anticipate the questions that they might have, what they might ask as a reasonable person, okay? So for that reason, you never want to let sources take over your paper. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure you have seen papers before, maybe when you were peer reviewing or something, in which you see like lots of source information, like quote, like a big quote or something, and then there's no insight from the person who wrote the paper. They just move on to another source. Okay, so you really don't want to do that. To avoid that, I tell you to do this. For every line of a direct or indirect quote that you use, have at least one line of your own commentary or analysis regarding that quote. Okay, so that really helps my students avoid letting the sources just totally dominate their essay. I also talk about where to put the counter arguments and the refutations. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Okay, so I will give you advice on how you should weave those into your essay. Some students I have, whose papers I've looked at in the past, have just allocated one paragraph and they've dumped all their counter arguments like later in the essay into that one paragraph. And I really don't think that's effective. I think you need to, again, anticipate what your audience is going to need to hear from you in order to be persuaded and convinced of what you're saying. And a lot of that has to do not just with the information you provide, but where you put the information. Yes, do remember that we are using MLA style guidelines for this essay. Also, the essay should be written in third person. Now, I know maybe some teachers might have said to you, it's okay to use I in your research paper, but I am very against using I unnecessarily, okay, in a research paper. I've let people do that maybe twice in the past 15 years for a research paper. And the reason that I was okay with those two people doing that is that they were almost experts, basically. They were experts in what they were talking about. Okay, so only if you are, an expert in what you're talking about and you can use that personal experience, would I let you do that? And even then, I might press you and say, can you find an expert outside of that can say what you would say about it, that you can actually document, okay? So I'm very cautious about letting students use I. Also, when you're writing the research paper, when you are introducing the source information, you want to use present tense verbs. So you would not say Smith stated. You would say Smith states. All right. Now, here's a breakdown of how the paper will be graded. You can see I've allocated a different number of points for each category. I've tried to be very, very particular because I really want you to know exactly the kinds of things that I'm looking for. So it's pretty elaborate. I'm sure I could have added more to this list, but let me go through this for just a moment and kind of describe for you what I'm looking for. So you definitely have to have a single sentence thesis statement at the end of the introduction, and that thesis should address the paper's subject. It should sort of express your stance, okay, as a writer, without using I. And the paper, the concept, the idea that you're talking about has to be suitable for college level. Okay, there are some topics that are just too elementary, so we want to make sure we are, using the right amount of complexity. First, the idea is complex enough and interesting enough and engaging enough for a college level audience. And then we're also making sure that we are arguing something. We're not just, doing an informative essay. So you can see here how, the maximum you can make on that is 10 points. And then I have a breakdown of what the grade would be for each letter. We have development, which is how much information you've provided to support. And not just how much information, but is it the right kind of information to support your position? So the information needs to be credible, relevant. You have to have reasons, examples, statistics when necessary, describing other evidence from outside sources to prove your thesis. You need analysis that actually gets to the heart of what you're talking about to clarify source information. And that means, you need to come in and, as a writer, you need to talk about what the sources are saying. Don't just leave it up to the reader to try to make sense of what the sources mean. And then logical and consistent relationship of ideas. One idea needs to flow into the next in a logical manner. Everything needs to make sense. I need to be able to understand why you've moved from this sentence to the next sentence, or this idea to the next idea. A technical use of sources, proper in-text MLA citations. You can learn, we will talk about that in detail, but always go back to the Prentice Hall Reference Guide. It will explain to you how to do that. That book might appear to be hard to use, rather intimidating, but once you get into it and you actually start looking at what it's trying to tell you and how it's laid it out on its various pages, you will see that it's going to be a big help for you, big help. All right. So you need to make sure that the citations that you've used in your paper match up correctly with the works cited entries that you've included at the end. I must know the difference between when I'm reading an idea that you came up with versus an idea from a source. And we can talk about how to make sure that you are distinguishing between those two. You have to integrate quotations appropriately. You don't want to use too much quoting. You also want to rely on summarizing and paraphrasing. Introducing your sources upon first use by using an appropriate signal phrase is very important. Learning how to use attributive tags like Smith states, so-and-so suggests, using quotation marks, how they're supposed to be used. Formatting properly, titles of books or titles of articles. Avoidance of formatting issues in the list of works cited and formatting issues in the essay itself. Obviously, plagiarism you want to avoid. Obviously, you want to avoid dropped quotation. We will talk about dropped quotations in detail, but that really refers to just taking a quotation and just plopping it in as its own sentence in your essay. You can't do that. You have to set that quotation up with a signal phrase. Right? Organization, where the information is placed in the essay, both inside paragraphs and within the larger essay itself. You have to make sure you have an appropriate engaging introduction, an appropriate conclusion. The structure that you use needs to mesh with what you're trying to get across. Your topic sentences, a topic sentence is the first sentence in a paragraph, like a body paragraph. That should not contain any source information, okay? Also, you should not put source information in the final sentence of a body paragraph. So you kind of want to make a little sandwich and have your source information between those two sentences, between the opening sentence of a body paragraph and the closing sentence of a body paragraph. You want to make sure that the sentences make sense within a paragraph, and you also want to make sure that when you move from one paragraph to the next, it's done in a logical way that makes sense for the reader. Style. All right, so again, you need to make complete sentences in this paper when you write. Avoid the sort of monotone quality that's created by sentences that are written the same way. So sentence variety is important. Using a consistent point of view, effective word choices, adroit, I say adroit, but not inflated vocabulary. I really don't think there's a problem with using bigger words. If it's appropriate, you don't want to load your paper with big words because you think it makes you sound smart. That will backfire. But making sure that the larger words you use actually mean what you think they mean is definitely something to look for. Also, passive voice, we'll talk about that more. You want to avoid run-ons and comma splices. And just some of these other issues that I've listed here that end up making your writing sound vague, wordy, ineffective. Okay. I do tell you that more than one run-on, comma splice, or fragment will reduce your grade by an additional 5 points. Let me back up for a second and point out something I said about dropped quotations. I did say here a dropped quotation will reduce your grade by an additional 5 points. Okay, so it's like, I understand it might happen once, but after that, same here with some of the sentence or style issues. Then we have grammar and mechanics. So things like subject-verb agreement, you know, did you use the right pronoun? Correct forms of internal punctuation and end punctuation. Where should you use a comma? You know, in a sentence, there are various comma rules that you'll probably need to brush up on during the semester. The use of the apostrophe, which I have noticed students kind of leave out sometimes. And then making sure you're capitalizing properly. So you can kind of see how much weight I've allotted to each of these categories. Development is a big one, because if you can't develop the idea, then you don't have a paper. Obviously, the thesis guides your whole entire paper, but you know, it is one sentence, so it doesn't count as much as some of these others, but it is extremely important because, I mean, the thesis is what helps you know where you're going in your paper, and certainly is supposed to help your reader know where you're going. All right, so technical use of sources is a big deal because it is a research paper, and we have to know how to integrate information, give proper credit for it. So that looks like pretty much everything. I do want to make this last point. Neglecting to establish the requested MLA page layout on the first and subsequent pages of the paper will result in an automatic deduction of 5 to 10 points. And then evident plagiarism will lead to automatic failure of the paper and possibly failure of the course. But before you get too worried about that, do know that I let you know if I see plagiarism. Okay, I let you know that. And by the time that you write that final draft, you will have no doubt whether you've accidentally plagiarized or not. And I give you ample opportunity to fix that. The big issue comes up when I tell people about the plagiarism I see and they don't take the effort to revise and do what they need to do to fix that. Okay? So those are the guidelines for the research paper.